for this opportunity. Oh, thank you. Okay, so we're going to start our workshop now. I apologize, me. So we have people here who are guests with us and sharing information with us in this update of census information. I'm going to turn it over immediately to Elizabeth, who is leading our workshop. Elizabeth Tolzman, thank you.
Thank you, Chair Carter and Commissioners. I am honored to present the Strategic Team Committee of the Whole workshop presentation today entitled Growth and Change in Ramsey County for you guys to get an update on census. The last time you guys had an update on this was actually almost exactly a year ago on November 24th, 2020, where we did a workshop to give you progress and update on our 2020 census work and the next steps in the census process. And this workshop is timely for 3 reasons. One, you'll be able to see the results of our work from Matt Schroeder and see what we've achieved and how our strategies have worked. 2, this also builds off the workshop you've heard on November 9th on redistricting, where we had Megan Dayton, senior demographer from the state demographer's office. She's also here with us today as well. And 3rd, as you heard from the board meeting this morning from County Manager O'Connor, we are receiving the AMC County Achievement Award on our census and voter engagement work. Commissioner Reinhardt mentioned this work at the last board workshop and how valuable that was to this. And I want to acknowledge Dr. Julie Wood, David Triplett, Emily Hunt, and the elections team under Director Bessler for all their great work in us achieving that award. So I'd like to introduce our primary presenter. It is Matt Schroeder. He's a principal researcher from the Met Council, and he'll share not only the results of Ramsey County's census count, but also do a deeper dive of this work of growth and change in Ramsey County. He'll focus on many of the questions that you guys asked 2 weeks ago, trends, diversity factors, the accuracy of the census data, going deeper on race, ethnicity, and culture, and how that information is collected, migration factors, and also the security of data. Also on standby, we have Megan Dayton, as I mentioned, from Minnesota Demographer's office, in case you have additional questions. We have our County Auditor and Treasurer, Director Bressler, Dr. Jolie Wood, and Cassie Fitzgerald from the policy team. And with that, and your permission, Chair Carter, I will hand it over to Mr. Schroeder.
Thank you, and welcome all.
All right, I'm hoping you can all hear me.
Yep, we can hear you, Matt.
Oh, wonderful, thanks. I'm flipping back and forth between PowerPoint and the browser to unmute, so apologies for that. So yeah, I did want to thank you first, Elizabeth and Chair Carter and Commissioners, for having me here today. I've really been looking forward to this discussion and hearing your ideas and questions too. I wanted first to start off by talking about making sure that we're all on the same page about what is and isn't available in this first batch of census data that came out in August. We've really just got the bare minimum necessary to redraw political districts. So total population, race and Hispanic or Latino origin. Later next year, we'll be getting more information, the detailed age and sex breakdown, household structure. But then that all comes from a complete count, the census. What we can't get from that is data on income and education and employment status and so on. That only comes from a sample. But even though we can't get a lot of information from the 2020 census, we can at least get as accurate a population total count as we can, or as the Census Bureau can. So today, mainly just for the topic, it's going to be mostly focused on the total population and race and Hispanic or Latino origin. There we go. Sorry about that. So as you've probably heard, the big news for Ramsey County is that the population is the highest that it's been in any census year, about a little over 552,000 people. And that is almost a 44,000 person gain from the 1960s, since 2010, which is the largest since the 1960s. So about an 8.6% growth rate, which again is very strong. And I think once we drill down beneath that county level, we can see that every jurisdiction as well, except for Lauderdale, has gained population since 2010. So growth is happening across the county as well. Once we drill down a bit farther, though, to census tracts, it's not the case that all these jurisdictions are growing evenly within themselves. There are areas within several cities that are losing population, not necessarily a lot, but still, I think it's helpful to add some nuance to this overall picture of growth that it's not occurring everywhere, but is, again, very strong in pockets of St. Paul, as well as in the northern suburbs. But yeah, as Elizabeth said, the main questions that I've heard you're most interested in are the trends in diversity, drilling down a bit more into that, the drivers, why is Ramsey County growing? And then the accuracy of the 2020 census data. So going into the trends in diversity first, I want to start off by just showing the terminology, which basically comes straight from the federal government via the Census Bureau. These are very unsatisfactory. A lot of different people prefer a lot of different terms. And what's more, all of these obscure a lot of diversity within the groups. So obviously the Black and African American population includes descendants of enslaved people, as well as more recent African immigrants. Same for the Hispanic or Latino population, which includes people whose ancestors have lived here for generations, as well as more recent arrivals. And then the Asian community includes many different groups, Hmong residents, Karen residents, Chinese residents, and Vietnamese residents, and so on. So there's definitely a lot of diversity within these groups that that we need to keep in mind as we're going through these. But this is really all that the Census Bureau allows us to do with this this complete count data. So as I think you've heard, all of Ramsey County's growth has come from the Black, Indigenous, and people of color population. And that is actually true for every jurisdiction as well. With the exception of Gem Lake and North Oaks, every local government in Ramsey County has lost white people since 2010. And with the exception of Lauderdale, which, as we've seen, is losing population anyway, every jurisdiction has gained people of color, Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So this is really true throughout the county as well. Looking at which of those major race groups this growth is coming from, that varies a lot across jurisdictions. So we see that in New Brighton and Roseville and St. Anthony, the Black and African American population was the largest growth in those three cities. In places like Arden Hills, White Bear Lake, the Hispanic and Latino community was the fastest growing. And then in places like Maplewood and North St. Paul, the Asian community had the most growth. So helpful to keep this variation in mind because, again, this very global category of Black, Indigenous, and people of color residents is just not satisfactory. We can also look at how this has evolved over time, going back to 1990, when Ramsey County's population was about 87% white. That is now, as you can see, considerably lower, about 58%. And these, I think it's noteworthy too that this growth in the Black, Indigenous, and people of color population isn't coming from just one of these major race groups. All of them are growing, with the exception of the American Indian population. I do want to mention just briefly that there are some complications in how the Census Bureau changed how they measure race and how they process the race data since 2010. So it's not quite a clean comparison, but I think even if everything remained the same, we would still reach the same conclusion that the vast majority, that all of Ramsey County's net population growth is coming from the Black, Indigenous, and people of color population. And this is this is really the future of Ramsey County as well. We can compare the population age 18 and up to the child population who's younger than 18, and very large differences there. Such that the child population of Ramsey County is only 37% white, 23% Asian, 19% Black or African American, 12% Hispanic or Latino. And so you can, I'm sure, imagine that as this cohort ages, this will really be the future of Ramsey County. Another way that we can look at this briefly is spatially, by looking at the most common race group in each census tract. Again, going back to 1990, the areas along University Avenue had in those areas, the Black population was the most common group. In the North End, for example, just north of downtown as well, the Asian population was the largest. And then in the west side of St. Paul, the Hispanic or Latino population was the most common group. But then to look at how this has changed over time, we can just see more and more areas where the Black or African American and the Asian population is the most common group. So as I'm sure you've heard, St. Paul is now majority Black, Indigenous, or people of color. And so obviously there's a lot of variation within the city. But just I think a good way to look at the how this is played out on the ground. And I do want to say too that if we went down another geographic level, there would be pockets of other suburban cities that had the most common race group as Black or Hispanic or Latino or Asian. But at this level, at least, we see it only in St. Paul. Although, as we play this out, I have no doubt that in the 2030 census, we will see a lot more on the map. That said, I just want to end this subject with by noting that the Black, Indigenous, and people of color population is actually declining in some areas. So along University Avenue in St. Paul and the west side of St. Paul as well. All other areas of the county, in all other areas of the county, that share the population is growing, but in these areas it's shrinking, which I wanted to mention mainly because of its relevance to the conversation around gentrification and displacement. There's a lot more to gentrification than race alone, and even so, it's not always the case that Black, Indigenous, and people of color residents are leaving, are declining in these areas. It's more that these areas are adding white people faster than they're adding Black, Indigenous, and people of color residents. But still, I think since these areas were identified by the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the University of Minnesota as watch areas, I guess, for gentrification, did want to at least note that here. So again, to sum up, dramatic growth among all of the major race groups in Ramsey County, with the exception of white and American Indian residents. We've seen more and more St. Paul census tracts where the most common race group is Black or African American or Asian. And then again, just some additional pieces to add to the gentrification and displacement debates. Nothing conclusive, but just additional facts to include in those debates. Turning now to where this growth is coming from, when we think about population growth, I think it's pretty natural to think that if our population is growing, we must be getting a lot of people moving here from elsewhere. And in the region as a whole and in Ramsey County, that is not the case. About 90% of Ramsey County's growth has come from natural increase. So more people are being born than are dying. And as a result, even if no one were moving into or out of Ramsey County, the population would still be growing. So then looking at that remaining 10% slice that is coming from migration, all of that is coming from outside the US. Ramsey County is actually losing people to the rest of the US. And I'll mention where that is on the next slide. But the big idea here is that the growth from migration is entirely from outside the US, primarily Africa and Asia. No surprise there, but just wanted to fill that in. So the Census Bureau has a helpful visualization tool that helps us look at where these, at where people are moving to from Ramsey County and moving from into Ramsey County. And this comes from, not from the 2020 census, but from another set of estimates from the Census Bureau. So it's, again, not quite as firm, I guess, as the 2020 census, but there is some Internal Revenue Service data available that kind of supports these main conclusions. So when we look at places that people are moving from into Ramsey County, again, we're seeing most of the movement within the upper Midwest, Minnesota and Wisconsin, and a little bit from Iowa too. So those orange shaded counties, people are moving from into Ramsey County. So a lot of greater Minnesota, Hennepin County, and so on. Those bluer shaded counties, people are moving out of Ramsey County into. So St. Louis County, again, some college towns are pretty typical. But yeah, I think what jumps out here is that a lot of the outflow of people from Ramsey County is to Dakota County and Washington County, as well as to Chisago County. So most of this movement is actually within the Twin Cities region, not so much to greater Minnesota or the rest of the US as a whole, which is, I think, pretty a common pattern, I think, for most counties in the region. Certainly it's true for Hennepin County as well. So Ramsey County is not exceptional in that. So to sum up there, most of Ramsey County's growth is due to natural increase. We've seen a lot of in-migration to Ramsey County from outside the US and some out-migration to primarily other counties in the Twin Cities region, the 7-county region. But the question is then, how much can we trust this 2020 census data, which is interesting in itself, but then also kind of becomes the basis for those estimates of migration, that one of the bases for those estimates of migration that were on the previous slide. And so we can approach this in a few ways. The first is by looking at where the data came from and how people responded. This is from Minnesota as a whole, which is the lowest level of detail that we can get for these all these different ways that people were counted. But about 3/4 came from people responding for themselves. Another 7% came from an in-person interview by a census worker. When that didn't happen, census workers went to people like neighbors or landlords who knew something about the household that could maybe fill in some details. And in a small number of the remaining cases, the Census Bureau had to take their best guess from either administrative records like Social Security, Medicare, government benefits, and so on. And then, or just looking at the households, just take their best guess based on other similar housing units around it. And so I think, yeah, the key is that, again, relative to 2010, things look fairly comparable for definitely up with respect to self-response, probably because of the internet response option. But looking at the total share of people who were counted by submitting a census form themselves or directly by a census worker, that's about where it was in 2010. So despite the fears that that COVID was going to throw a large monkey wrench into the works here, that doesn't seem to have played out for Minnesota as a whole. But of course, there's a lot of geographic variation in self-response. And so we can see large swaths of St. Paul where the self-response rate was under 2/3 of the population of addresses. The response rate is a lot higher in the northern suburbs, Highland Park area of St. Paul, for example. And of course you can, if you imagine overlaying demographics on this, you can see a trend, at least, that in places with more Black, Indigenous, and people of color residents, response rates tended to be lower. And we can't say anything from that fact about the exact self-response rates of each group, which we can't get from Census Bureau data, but there is a definite pattern there. But on the plus side, in a lot of areas, the response rate increased from 2010. So with the exception of some areas along West 7th, University Avenue in St. Paul, and the northern part of what I think is Arden Hills, the response rate actually increased since 2010, which is good news. And given the award that the Association of Minnesota Counties is giving Ramsey County, I think is a testament to the success that Ramsey County and other organizations had too in getting out the count, which is so important, as you all know, in getting federal funds, political representation, and so on. Second, I think it's worth touching at least briefly on the new method of privacy protection that the Census Bureau implemented for the 2020 census, which is basically boils down to adding random noise into the numbers that they publish. They did not edit the total state population or the number of housing units anywhere, but everything else is subject to change, subject to this noise. And so a lot of people have been worried about like, what is this going to do for our knowledge of the region, especially with respect to the demographics of race and ethnicity, which had been a serious concern in previous versions of this data that they had released. But on the basis of at least one product, it doesn't seem that consequential. So the Census Bureau did helpfully publish another version of the 2010 census data run through their new privacy protection algorithm. And so we can compare those two to get a sense of how the new method of privacy protection compares to what might otherwise have been published. So you can see here from this table with the original 2010 counts in that the column labeled original, the new method of privacy protection next to it, that the total population of Ramsey County is different by only 2 people. And looking at the other major race groups as well, a shift of fewer than 100 people, which looking at the percent difference is generally pretty small, with the exception, unfortunately, of the American Indian population, which the new method understates by about 0.6%, which is not to say that the same is necessarily true for 2020, but we can at least look at the general magnitude of these shifts. We can also look briefly at the population share of each of these major race groups, and that at least really has very little change, talking about on the order of 1/100th of 1 percentage point. So at least at the county level, as well as in what we've seen at other geographic levels too, including cities and townships, the new method produces numbers that are pretty similar to what was originally published in 2010. So again, we can't necessarily say from this anything about the 2020 census, but if everything had remained the same, this does suggest at least that we'd be seeing pretty similar numbers as a whole, with as the Census Bureau states, more complete and certain privacy protection. And then finally, a topic that I know is of concern to a lot of people and in the general public as well. So undercounts, how complete was the count? The Census Bureau does the best job they can, but well, how good was it? Obviously, there's a long history of people being undercounted, especially Black residents, as well as children under 18, and especially children under 5. And given that, plus the additional complications in 2020, we would, I think a lot of us have been worried about the potential for an undercount. So there was the efforts to add a citizenship question to the 2020 census that, even though it wasn't successful, I know people have been concerned that even just those debates floating around out there might have made people very suspicious of the census. There was the pandemic, of course, that delayed the follow-up of census workers with people who didn't respond themselves. And then at the end of the census count, there were a lot of shifting deadlines. At first, it was going to be October 31st, and then the administration shifted it back to September 30th, and then lawsuits eventually pushed it to October 15th. But with those shifting deadlines, I think it further complicated an already complicated effort to follow up with people who hadn't responded themselves. So given these complications, I think we're very concerned about an undercount. And there aren't studies of this in our region yet, but a couple of nationwide studies have tried to quantify the undercount, and they found that the Black or African American population may have been undercounted by between 2.5% and 5%, which is considerably more than in the 2010 census. The Hispanic or Latino population by about 2%. Children by about 2%, renters by 2%, but especially thinking about those citizenship question efforts, households with a non-citizen living there may have been undercounted by around 3.5%. So definitely a lot of concern there. We need to wait until the Census Bureau completes another survey, which should be out sometime next year, the post-enumeration survey, to be able to say more. This is where they follow up directly with people who were counted in the census to figure out how accurately, as well as attempt to reach people who may not have been counted, to get a sense of how the total population counts compare. And so while we need to wait for that, I think it's unfortunately pretty safe to say, based on history and the unique aspects of 2020, that that various populations, especially Black, Indigenous, and people of color residents, as well as households with non-citizens in them, were undercounted. We also, I know, have been concerned about potential undercounts in group quarters facilities, so group housing arrangements like college dormitories, nursing homes, and so on. Especially, I know, in college dormitories and college housing, since a lot of colleges and universities sent their students home right before Census Day of 2020. And so what we're seeing, thankfully, is that those numbers aren't too different from what we expect at the Met Council based on the annual survey that we do of these facilities and these colleges and universities. So with the exception of the University of Northwestern, which is in the census at least about 120 people lower than what our survey had said, the population counts aren't too far off from what we expected. And again, these are, they come from different sources, slightly different sources, I guess. The Census Bureau may have found some of these students at their parents' homes, but because they normally live and sleep in their college, they may have been enumerated that way. So not quite similar, but not too far off from what we had expected. And so finally, just to wrap up, self-response rates are generally up from 2010, though of course there's a lot of variation in that. Privacy protection, that new method, doesn't seem to have much of an effect on the accuracy of the data for most geographies. And then undercounts, unfortunately, are quite likely, but at least in the case of college housing, it does look okay. I should mention too that the Hubert H. Humphrey Job Corps Center on Snelling in St. Paul seems to be completely missing from the Census Bureau data. And so they've recently announced an effort that will let us add those facilities back into the data, which is quite a relief. With that, I will wrap up. I want to just mention quickly that we have a lot of products on our website at metrocouncil.org/census2020 for general audiences, especially local jurisdictions, and then more researchy people in county and city staff areas. So with that, I will wrap up and really look forward to whatever questions and ideas and perspectives you bring.
Wow, thank you so very, very much, Matt, for this complete and comprehensive presentation. Commissioners have held quiet because we've all been anxious to hear, and thank you so much for taking this compressed time and making this presentation, which has so much information in it. While commissioners are waiting perhaps to ask or form their questions, let me just go back to the comment that you made as you were presenting slide 33. You said something about, and I must have been jotting a note and didn't catch it completely, Hubert H. Humphrey Job Corps being missing from, okay. And I know why. I was thinking of another facility. I was thinking of a University Avenue facility, but you were talking about Hubert H. Humphrey along Snelling. That seems to be missing entirely. Is that what you said from this?
We're still conducting a really detailed review of all the group quarters facilities, but at least from what I can see in that general area, in looking at the census data for that general area, there are no residents of group quarters facilities. So
it'd be
my
interesting.
assumption is that,
Yeah, go ahead. Your assumption?
oh, my assumption is that, yeah, it was not in the Census Bureau's list.
And I would wonder if that is because those residents may have reported another address of, their parents, their home, whatever that might have been before moving to that facility. But it will be interesting to find out if we can confirm that. I see a hand up from Commissioner McDonough.
Thanks, Chair Carter. I want to go back to slides 25 and 26 on the response rates. And of course, 25 shows that we're for the most part in St. Paul, our self-response rate is lower than probably the suburban and Mac Groveland, Highland Park areas. But then on slide 26, some of the good news is we're actually getting a higher rate than we did from 2010. And this is for our team, we put the effort into voter engagement and the response here for the census. And I'm just wondering, if I recall right, we focused on certain areas, and I don't recall if we use census tracts or Senate districts or House districts or what we used when we focused in on areas, because early on when we first started talking about this was the recognition that we had the lowest voter turnout in a number of the House districts. But I'd like to get a sense of where we're seeing that 5 to 18% increase from 2010 to 2020. How does that overlay with our efforts to increase the response rate for the census?
So is that a question for our team? And
Yeah. That's yeah, exactly. So the folks that led that effort, where we did the focus, and are we seeing that greater, 5 to 18.9% increase in those areas? Or I wanted to get a sense of, again, the impact. We're getting the award. We know we did some good things. We know that things are moving up. But I wanted to get a finer look at this of, overlaying where we focused in the actual results here on the change from 2010 to 2020.
Thank you for that question. I know that Elizabeth is on the line. I'm not sure if there are others who might have a response to that at this time, but to make that relationship understood is necessary.
Chair Carter and Commissioner McDonough, Dr. Wood has her hand up. She can respond to that.
Hi, Chair Carter and Commissioner McDonough. We focused our outreach efforts on those areas where we knew it would be, where we knew undercount was most likely. And what that means is that we focused on those areas where you still see that, self-response actually declined a bit in some of those areas, but it also increased a lot in some of those areas. And we're talking about primarily in St. Paul, not exclusively in St. Paul, but in those areas that tend to be more diverse, where there are high proportions of historically undercounted communities living there. Now, because of the unique challenges of the 2020 census, our efforts, while they did succeed, I believe in getting a lot of people who might not have otherwise self-responded to self-respond. Clearly, we were not able to reach everyone. So you see that there are some declines in some census tracts where we were focusing our efforts the most. Those census tracts, especially the darker green ones in towards the northeast of the county, we did not necessarily focus our outreach efforts in those areas. So the increase in self-response rates would be due to other factors. For example, perhaps because of the internet self-response option. I wouldn't really know exactly what would account for that.
Yeah, thank you. Yep, that's helpful. Could we get a map where it overlays where you focus so we can really specifically see that and try to attach value and impact, right, to our efforts here, and really trying to understand what's working and what's not working here as we're trying to increase response rates.
Madam
Thank you.
Chair,
Go
if I
ahead.
could just add one piece to Commissioner McDonough's point. We can do that. Jolie, we got to go back and look at the specific areas we identified from those initial workshops, and we can overlay those because we did have some specific units. The one thing I will say that this map doesn't, it's an important overlay, but not the end one, is that ultimately it's the number. Self-response is a good indicator of building trust and rapport, but even if people responded through the process of door-to-door census and not self-report, we want to make sure we capture that as well. And if the trust allowed for that as a part of the growth in our response, that'll also be important. So there's one other cut too in the final data from the census side that matters beyond self-report that we'll incorporate, but the point is good, and we will make a map that overlays those specific areas of engagement that we identified from the outset.
Yeah,
Thank you,
Madam Chair, if I may, if I could follow up. Yeah, Ryan, I actually looked at that when I'm trying to pull up the slide on the percentages of self-report versus who reported on the door-to-door. And I was surprised the small amount that, I can't find the slide right now, but I think it was 7% was the response rate on the interviews. Yeah, there it is. And so it's actually, I agree with you, that does have an impact on the overlay, but actually a pretty small response or pretty small impact. I was surprised. I thought that door-to-door interview would drive a higher percentage of reporting than it does.
Thank you. Thank you for the observations, Commissioner McDonough, and for the commitment to getting the report back to us. I will turn to Commissioner Reinhardt. And before I do, let me just note that it is just about 12 o'clock. And while we have the experts on the line with us, those of us who can stay, I appreciate it if we stay to wrap up this conversation. Commissioner Reinhardt, I hope that our experts can also stay with us. Commissioner Reinhardt.
Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a question, actually going back to the housing on Snelling that you think was not even, was not entered at all. So it's a specific question about that, but a more general question as well. First of all, looking at page 32, in the case of college housing, I guess I'm assuming that the facility that you feel was not counted at all does not have a significant number of people that it would have a big impact. But so I would like to know what do you expect from that if in fact it was not counted at all? But the other part of this is whether or not, because I know that communities, neighborhoods, I mean, you're going through it all, but they have an opportunity if they didn't agree with something in the census. I remember that from the 2010 census, that they had an opportunity to make a case for, I don't think they tried to reduce it in cases, but oftentimes tried to say, well, you didn't count this or this was missed. So what is the timeline on getting all of those relatively small factors, I would think, in place so that we have the actual number? Because there's a lot of work being done right now on redistricting. And if there are possibility of significant changes, clearly we need to have that sooner rather than later. So can you talk to me about the impact on changes and when it would be expected and how that will be dealt with in the redistricting process?
Sure, Chair Carter, Commissioner Reinhardt. To address the first question first, if memory serves, I'll have to go back and look at this, but the Job Corps Center has been on the order of 200, 300 people in our surveys. I could be misremembering, but that's at least at the top of my head what I remember. So not inconsiderable. The opportunity to adjust the counts, that is called the Count Question Resolution Program, which is scheduled to start in January of 2022. So in just in a couple months, that is where I believe the highest elected official of governments, whether that is county or city governments, can submit a challenge to the Census Bureau, and they have to fall into pretty narrow categories. So for example, a geographic error in drawing boundaries that resulted in some housing getting shifted from one place into another. The adding in new housing has been, that is not something that the Count Question Resolution Program, unfortunately, has been willing to entertain in the past. So the standard of proof is fairly high. The evidence that needs to be submitted is fairly high. There is, though, as I mentioned before, that kind of a supplementary process this time to add back in any group quarters facilities that may have been missed, like it seems the Job Corps Center was. So that is something that, as much as we, as well as the State Demographic Center, tried to make sure that their list of group quarters facilities was complete, some of them may not have been in the list to begin with, and so it was hard to catch them. So that is something that we can use to add those back in. But my understanding is that by law, the enumeration, adding new housing, et cetera, has to wrap up. It cannot happen anymore because the apportionment counts and the redistricting data have already been provided. So any corrections that are made as part of these processes will not alter the 2020 census counts for the purpose of redistricting. They will go into future sets of population estimates from the Census Bureau. So things going forward after the 2020 census will reflect those corrections, as well as the kind of a separate set of edits to the 2020 census data. But unfortunately, that will not feed back into the redistricting process.
Well, I think given the timeline of when the redistricting process has to be complete, which I believe is in February, or that's when the courts, who are also going forward right now, on the possibility that the state legislature doesn't do that. So that is good to know, because that caused a moment of panic, because if we didn't have all the data, and redistricting would have to be, it would be kind of a mess, I guess is what it comes down to. So what I'm understanding you're saying is, yes, there will be adjustments that will be made through different processes. However, for redistricting, the numbers that we have today are the numbers.
Chair Carter, Commissioner, that is correct.
Okay,
yes.
Thank you very much.
All right, I have Commissioner McGuire, and then I saw a question. I think there may be a question from Commissioner McGuire, from Commissioner McDonough.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was going to ask the same question that Commissioner McDonough asked in the chat. Because we're now talking about adding back in, will that, and Commissioner McDonough, you can add more if you'd like, but my question was, when you add back in, will that, it won't affect redistricting, but will it affect the dollars allocated by the federal government? And at what point does adding back in cease to be the number that they use for all these formulas that we know, matter for our funding programs?
Right, Chair Carter, Commissioner McGuire. I'm not an expert on the
Yeah.
complete variety of federal funds, and it's a lot of them that are determined by Census Bureau data. But for a lot of them, as I understand it, are determined from American Community Survey data, that sample that I mentioned earlier. And that eventually, as a result of these corrections, those corrections will kind of make their way into that sample. So eventually, yes, this will kind of make more accurate that distribution of federal funds that depends on the American Community Survey.
That's good to know. Thank you. Thank you for that. I do have just another question. I see that we're doing this by self-reporting, and so I'm seeing some of these tracks, where there's a higher degree of self-reporting. And I think, and Commissioner Reinhardt was asking a question similar to this, I think, but to overlay the increase of housing, like I'm just looking at my district, like where we had a higher increase of self-reporting, was it just that more people reported, or that there's just more people to report? So is it more that there's more people to report, or it's more people reporting? Do you understand my question? Yeah.
I believe so. So Chair Carter, Commissioner McGuire, these are rates. So this would be per 100 people who responded.
Okay.
So the simple addition of more people wouldn't necessarily increase the response rate, but if it does kind of change the composition of the tract, the area that kind of brings in more people who are more likely to self-respond, then yes, that could potentially be one reason for the increase in response rates. And this actually is related to a question that Commissioner McDonough asked before, expressed some surprise about the fact that the interview, only 7% of addresses were counted through in-person interviews, 14% by having to ask a neighbor or landlord. That was roughly flipped in 2010. So more people were enumerated through interviews in 2010. So this does seem to be kind of like an effect of the pandemic.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Just one last question. You said there's an out-migration from Ramsey and Hennepin, or maybe just Ramsey, into the other greater metropolitan area, the other counties in our area. And is that, did I hear that correctly? That it's they're not going to the rural parts of Minnesota, they're just going to the greater metro. And do we know, we don't know why, or maybe that's just a question that we'll be analyzing. But am I correct in that assumption?
Chair Carter, Commissioner McGuire, yes, you described it accurately. Most of the people who are moving out of Ramsey County, most of them do go to the rest of the Twin Cities region, primarily Washington County and Dakota County. And that is true as well for Hennepin County. So on balance, roughly as many people move into Ramsey County from Hennepin County as move from Ramsey to Hennepin County. But in terms of, the outside of the 7-county region, we typically see some net migration to college towns, which maybe kind of shows up on the map. But then, of course, St. Paul has many colleges and universities itself, so would be would balance that out as well. But yes, most of the population shifts that are kind of within the United States are actually within the region for Ramsey County.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I would also want to know if that is a typical observation between larger urban counties or urban areas of counties and other areas. If that is true across the United States, and then I see that Commissioner Maz-Castillo has a question, but is there a comment there? Is there a comment direct?
Chair Carter, I haven't looked at those numbers specifically, but I believe so. There's been, a lot of national attention to the resurgence of central cities, as well as population growth in the suburbs. So I'm pretty sure that that is kind of a national dynamic that is playing out here as well. As to Commissioner McGuire's question about the reasons that people might be moving out, that is unfortunately something that we can't get. And that is, I think, maybe something that people who are closer to the ground, planning staff and policy staff, might have a better sense of, as given the changes in land use and housing availability. But unfortunately, I can't say a lot about that myself.
I appreciate your going there, and we'll look forward to mining this information as we continue. I will go to Commissioner Mascasio.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for this really good presentation, Matt. I guess my questions are around, so what does this tell us? Now we see where people are, we see people are moving, but what does it really mean? And I'm just wondering if the Met Council has any plans to kind of more than just track numbers, track out why people are moving. What's the average length of stay in Ramsey County? If we're seeing that most of our immigrants are coming from other places, is it a matter of getting settled, getting jobs, and figuring out what the rest of Minnesota or the region has to offer and then moving? And then also I wanted to just ask a little more on, you kind of alluded to, potential gentrification or what it might look like on a map, especially along the University Avenue corridor. And we know that we put in a light rail there. There was a lot of kind of conversation that would create gentrification. Is that what we're seeing? Or is it indeed, I think you mentioned that it's not that Black and brown folks were moving, but that more white people are moving in a higher rate along that corridor. So if you can just dissect that just a little bit more and what these maps actually tell us, and then what maybe the future of this information might lead to get better data on the why.
Sure, Chair Carter, Commissioner Montes Castillo. As far as the council plans to kind of use this as a springboard, I fear that's more of a question for our policy people, but most broadly, this information will feed into the next regional plan that will be developed over the next couple years. So that will eventually guide the local comprehensive plans. And it is something I think that as we see more of these population shifts, we are very much more attentive to equity, to race equity. And so I think that these broader trends, both the population growth patterns in different places, which has been a lot more balanced than it has in previous decades in the central core, as well as the suburban and suburban edge communities, that will inform the next iteration of the regional plan, which local and county governments will have a lot of input into. On the gentrification subject, it is the data summarizing the number of people per tract can't point with any certainty to gentrification. We don't know how many people are moving in and out, just what it looked like in 2010 and what it looked like in 2020. So even though I guess I would say that this it is suggestive of some population shift, but as far as displacement goes, it is that's a bit harder to say, because the number of Black, Indigenous, and people of color residents hasn't declined in most of these areas. That said, there is a lot more to gentrification and displacement than just than people and where they live. So as the character of the neighborhood changes, the business mix changes, and so on, everyday interactions, the look of the neighborhood and feel, that sort of cultural displacement may be more of an issue. And I think that that's what points to the need for more qualitative research that the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the U of M has been doing. So I think that's in some, the census data kind of provide another piece of information, more that's, I guess, more definite than the quantitative data that we've had so far since the light rail came in. But those effects that can't really be captured by census data, that needs some more detailed work in person with the community.
Thank you. so very, very much again for this complete presentation and for responding even on the line with us a bit longer than you had planned to our questions. The overview that you've shared with us is informative to our strategic plan and work, our priorities that we have set within Ramsey County. And I know that as we look deeper into further analysis and gain additional information, it will help drive our plans moving forward. I want to say thank you. I'm looking back to make certain that commissioners on the line have no further questions. I thank you for staying on with us as you have, and thank all our staff for the work that has been done here in preparation for this workshop, but also for all of the amazing work that has been done and for which we look forward to celebrating with you at the Association of Minnesota Counties Award Banquet. If there are no further questions, I will turn to you, Matt, for any final comments you might have as we wrap up the workshop.
Just to thank you, Chair Carter, and the commissioners, and as well as the city staff who helped set this up. It's always great to get this information out there, but also to hear the questions and ideas and perspectives that you have, because this helps us figure out what else that we need to produce that would be helpful. So thank you all for those too.
Excellent. So we'll look forward to the responses to questions that have been asked here of our staff. We appreciate the work that you'll do to present that new information to us and to the ongoing work of mining this information for our better planning and implementation. With that, I am going to say thank you all for staying late with us today. We appreciate your time and focus and attention, and most of all, the information. Everybody have a good day.
Thank you. Well done.